Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a story that was hidden for decades. A secret army operating across Europe, a network so covert it existed beyond governments, beyond oversight, beyond public knowledge. For years, NATO, the CIA, and MI6 all denied its existence, but the truth couldn't stay buried. This is the story of Operation Gladio, a shadow force built to defend against invasion, yet capable of influencing politics, manipulating events, and shaping history in silence. To some, it was a shield. To others, a weapon operating in the shadows. Before we get started, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, only if you genuinely love uncovering the hidden corners of history. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing who's awake, chasing these secrets night after night around the world. Now, slow your thoughts. Tonight, we travel back to post-war Europe, when streets were calm, governments were rebuilding, and an invisible army, trained, armed, and ready, waited in silence. The operation that was supposed to protect democracy was about to reveal how the shadows themselves could rewrite it. Let's begin. The crate had no reason to be there, no trace of a supply line or a soldier's footprint, just the iron weight of something buried to be forgotten. When the spade cracked the lid open, the air that escaped was not the smell of rust or soil, but the ghost of a war that was supposed to be over. Inside were weapons wrapped in oilcloth, their steel untouched by time, as though someone expected to need them tomorrow. The man who found it did not know he had uncovered the first thread of a secret stitched across half a continent. They called it protection, but protection always begins with a secret, and once a secret is born, it rarely stays obedient. In the years after the last shots of the Second World War, Europe looked like a graveyard of futures. Cities smoldered, regimes collapsed, and in the smoke of the ruins, a new war was already being whispered into existence. The Soviet Union, swollen with victory and occupation, cast its shadow over the continent, and in Washington and London, there was no faith that peace would hold. To men who had fought in the dark corners of Europe, one conclusion seemed obvious. If the Red Army marched again, they would swallow everything in their path, and conventional armies would not rise in time to stop them. So the idea was simple, elegant in its brutality. Prepare for defeat before the battle even began. Scatter hidden arsenals, build invisible units, leave behind fragments of an army buried in ordinary life, and when the tanks rolled west, light the fuse. The man who carried this idea from theory into the bloodstream of post-war Europe was not a spy master out of fiction, but a weary officer shaped by shadows. He had lived through the Special Operations Executive, had sent men into enemy lines knowing many would never return, and the ache of those losses never loosened. In his mind, failure came not from weakness, but from unpreparedness. He swore never again to let democracies fall because they had no teeth when surprise came. That oath was not made in public, but whispered over maps, signed in ink that would never touch the light of oversight. He believed secrecy itself was the weapon, that silence could hold a line where armies could not. The plan spread quietly across nations that were rebuilding their streets while unknowingly hosting ghost soldiers. Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, each promised not only loyalty to NATO, but a hidden clause unspoken. When collapse came, their soil would yield soldiers who had vanished into the folds of civilian life. Some were former resistance fighters who already knew the taste of secrecy. Others were recruited under the banner of patriotism, told that their neighbors could never know, that even their wives must never suspect. The oaths were made with a solemnity that tasted like faith, but they bound men not to their people, but to a structure that lived outside constitutions. The caches were buried in fields and forests, in basements and mountain bunkers, crates of rifles, and radios sleeping under the earth. They were marked only in ledgers coded to mean nothing, numbers with no names. A man could walk every day across the same square of ground that hid enough arms to wage a private war, and never know. For those who designed it, that ignorance was proof of success. The perfect defense was one nobody could see, not even those meant to be defended. Yet, the cost of invisibility is that it can turn back on itself, and even the most devoted architect cannot control what happens when silence breeds its own logic. In smoky back rooms of London and Washington, committees drew lines on maps and spoke with the certainty of men who believed history bowed to their will. The Soviets might invade, or they might not, but either way, the network would wait. Every month, new crates left warehouses under the cover of routine shipments. New names were folded into lists that were never meant to surface. Each step was justified as insurance. But the more elaborate the web became, the less it resembled mere protection, and the more it resembled a second government, one with no voters and no borders. The officer who had once sworn to keep Europe safe walked through his garden at dusk, listening to the silence of his home, and knew his family could never understand the life he lived between shadows. He looked at his children playing and thought of the men he had sworn to prepare for death without ever knowing when or where it would come. It was not cruelty that hardened him, but conviction. He believed that when the day arrived and soldiers were needed who did not exist, the network would rise like ghosts from the soil. Yet a whisper lingered in him even as he tried to silence it. If you build an army that answers to no one, how long before it decides who the enemy is on its own? One evening, as dusk swallowed the horizon, a colleague slid a folder across his desk. The paper was unmarked, the contents thin but chilling. A proposal that hinted not only at resisting invasion, but at shaping politics before invasion even came. A ledger of payments, odd names that should not have been there, and a single word scrawled at the top in heavy ink, a word that meant nothing and everything: Gladio. And the ledger was not complete, because one name had been struck through so hard that the page tore. Someone wanted a piece of the story erased, but erasers have a way of calling attention to themselves. And in the silence of that line, the officer felt the first tremor of doubt. The strike-through on the ledger lingered in his mind like smoke in a closed room, a reminder that secrets never die quietly. Each name erased was a warning, a whisper from the shadows that even among allies, trust was brittle and fleeting. He slid the folder back into the drawer, the corners of the paper curling like the edges of history itself, and knew that the web he had helped weave was already pulling threads in directions he could not see. Across Europe, men who had sworn oaths to vanish into anonymity were waking each morning as ordinary citizens while carrying the weight of invisible orders that might never come. And some of those orders were already being misread, reshaped, repurposed in quiet rooms far from public eyes. Recruitment became a delicate balance between loyalty and plausibility. Former partisans, hardened by years of clandestine resistance, were ideal candidates. They understood that failure was personal and silence sacred. Young men, eager for purpose in the rubble of a continent, were carefully screened, taught that patriotism sometimes required action without applause, and indoctrinated into a philosophy that morality could be folded like paper into the shape of necessity. Each recruit received a brief coded dossier, a set of instructions that might never be executed, and a map dotted with locations that seemed meaningless until they were needed. Every interaction was measured, every question deflected, and the network grew in layers, each layer a mirror of the one above it, reflecting secrets back on themselves. The supply lines were a feat of quiet engineering. Crates moved under innocuous covers. Agricultural shipments, office furniture, furniture stores' routine deliveries. Warehouses held stock that no one knew existed, and within them, radios and rifles lay in wait, speaking a language of readiness that no civilian could hear. The officer overseeing these operations would sometimes visit the warehouses in the dead of night, listening to the silence, feeling the pulse of the hidden army beneath his feet, and marvel at the audacity of building something so vast without ever being seen. Every successful concealment reinforced the belief that invisibility was not only protection, but power, and yet in the back of his mind, the thought lingered. Power that is unseen can also be uncontrolled. Across capitals, the planners spoke in whispers and codes. In Paris, Rome, Brussels, agents met in safe houses to discuss shipments and drills, their conversations a careful choreography of ambiguity. A street could be crossed 1,000 times, the man walking it unaware that beneath his feet lay weapons meant to stop a future invasion. In Berlin, recruits were instructed to integrate fully into society, to plant seeds in offices and factories, to remember faces and routines that would later serve a purpose no one could predict. The network did not demand heroism in the moment. It demanded patience measured in years, sometimes decades. And yet, as meticulously as the network grew, the officer sensed the fragility beneath its veneer. Files vanished or were altered. Names were crossed out in bold strokes, erasures that spoke louder than the words themselves. Was it oversight? Sabotage? Or a hint that some of these operations were already being bent toward agendas beyond mere defense? He could not know, but the ledger's torn edge whispered that the line between preparation and manipulation was thinner than anyone dared admit. In quiet moments, he walked his garden paths at dusk, thinking of the young recruits learning to vanish into normal life, the families who would never understand, and the consequences that might ripple silently through the decades. Each buried cache, each hidden radio, was a promise and a threat simultaneously, and the full weight of that duality pressed on him with every evening wind that stirred the leaves. Somewhere across borders and alliances, men like him were doing the same, building invisible engines of war, while the continent slept, confident that the day of reckoning would never arrive, or, if it did, would only reward those who had the foresight to prepare in shadows. But shadows have a way of outliving intentions, and in the quiet, behind the walls of ordinary homes, the network stirred, unseen yet alive, a silent army that had been waiting for a war that might never come, or worse, a war of its own making. The first cracks were invisible, yet they would echo through the decades, shaping politics, terror, and the very notion of who could be trusted in a Europe that believed itself free. And in that ledger, the erased name and the word Gladio burned like a warning. What is hidden will one day demand recognition, and what is silent will one day speak. The first seeds of doubt were planted, not in the recruits, not in the operatives, but in the minds of the architects themselves, who began to ask in whisper-had moments whether the army they had built to defend democracy might one day operate against it, unseen and unstoppable. The quiet that once marked the streets of post-war Europe began to hum with an uneasy undercurrent, almost imperceptible to ordinary citizens, but palpable to those who had trained themselves to listen for the unseen. The network that had been conceived to resist an invasion that might never come had grown in complexity and scope, threading itself into the very fabric of daily life. Its members walked among neighbors, attended local meetings, ran businesses, and smiled in classrooms while carrying in their minds a dossier of instructions and a map of hidden arsenals that no one else could perceive. The line between civilian and soldier, ordinary citizen and covert operative, had blurred, and in that ambiguity, the first seeds of internal tension began to sprout. It was in Italy that the first serious questions of loyalty, control, and morality emerged. The so-called years of lead had begun, though few could yet see the shape of the storm. Bombs in piazzas, anonymous threats against political figures, arsons in quiet neighborhoods. Each incident seemed disconnected, a random tragedy, until careful observers began to notice patterns that suggested coordination. The ledger of Gladio units, once a dry bureaucracy of codes and names, now hinted at connections between secret cells and actions that went far beyond training exercises. What was meant to resist occupation began, in some instances, to interfere with the democratic process itself, and the architects of the network faced the first gnawing realization. The invisible army they had built could not be contained within the ethical frameworks they had assumed. Across Europe, Whispers spread through the corridors of power. Members of parliament, journalists, and police officers who had glimpsed fragments of the network reported anomalies. Untraceable movements of weapons, unreported deaths, men whose histories did not match the lives they led in plain view. Families of victims received anonymous letters, each signed with cryptic symbols, and local authorities found themselves navigating a labyrinth without a map. The planner watched these developments with a growing sense of unease. Each bomb that detonated, each shadow that moved with deliberate intent, reminded him that control is always an illusion when the machinery is distributed across borders and identities unknown. The recruits, for their part, often had no conception of the scale of the operations they were a part of. A young man in Brussels, formerly a resistance fighter, carried a radio in the attic of his apartment building for decades, checking it at prescribed intervals, never hearing a single message. A woman in Rome, trained to memorize addresses and names of potential safe houses, filed them mentally, while her neighbors debated politics and baked bread, never realizing the invisible responsibilities that shadowed her every day. Obedience was measured not in heroics, but in quiet, patient adherence to instructions that might never be used. And yet, in their silence and diligence, they became vessels for a power they could neither see nor fully comprehend. In the smoky rooms of NATO offices, the architects of these networks debated expansions and logistics with meticulous care. Brussels, Bonn, London, each capital contributed to a tapestry that was meant to defend freedom, but now began to resemble a self-contained organism, a system with its own momentum. Funds were allocated through shadow budgets, disguised as humanitarian aid or infrastructure projects. Transport routes were layered beneath legitimate commerce, invisible in plain sight. Officers exchanged handwritten notes in meetings that felt bureaucratic on the surface, but contained encrypted instructions that could alter the lives of hundreds. The network's growth was measured not by headlines, but by whispers and shadows, and in the careful abstraction of those operations lay the first hints of moral compromise. The first signs that the network might be misused were subtle, almost imperceptible. In Rome, a cell was instructed to monitor leftist political movements under the guise of anti-communist readiness. In Belgium, weapons caches were found in proximity to politically sensitive districts. The reasoning behind the placements buried in coded correspondence that left investigators with more questions than answers. Each small deviation from the original defensive intent introduced the potential for actions that were neither defensive nor strictly sanctioned. And as the network's footprint grew, oversight weakened. Even those who had once believed in the absolute necessity of the operation began to sense that the machinery might develop its own logic, its own momentum independent of the original architect's intentions. In Brussels, a quiet clerk working in the Ministry of Defense noticed an irregularity in a shipment record. Crates destined for military storage had been rerouted without explanation to a civilian warehouse, under the watch of men who had once been partisans in the war. At first, he dismissed it as a clerical error, but as the pattern repeated, the unease settled in. Who were the men making these decisions? What authority did they answer to, if not the elected government? In Italy, similar anomalies were noted, yet the bureaucrats dared not ask too many questions, fearing to uncover a mechanism they were ill-equipped to comprehend. The operative known only as the teller, a parliamentary aide and investigative journalist combined into one restless figure, began piecing together the scattered clues from different countries. In phone calls that were never traced and letters that were never delivered, the outline of the network began to emerge. He learned that some of the cells had already been mobilized, though not for the war they had been trained to resist. Operations were conducted under the guise of national security, but evidence suggested a darker undercurrent. Actions that destabilized governments, spread fear, and manipulated public opinion. Each revelation struck like a small explosion, the consequences invisible but pervasive, and the teller realized that the story he was chasing was more than a historical account. It was a living, breathing web of influence that had quietly shaped the political landscape for decades. Families of victims from unexplained bombings and sabotage incidents began to surface, each bearing the emotional weight of acts that were officially dismissed or attributed to unknown groups. A widow in Milan, clutching a faded photograph of her husband, recounted a series of threats that escalated before his sudden disappearance. In Turin, a father spoke of letters left at his door, unsigned but ominous, predicting events that had no discernible source. The pattern was becoming undeniable, and the planner, who had once believed in the purity of preparation, now confronted a moral crucible. The network he had built to defend civilization might be wounding it from within. Across the continent, the architects attempted damage control. Meetings became longer, more clandestine. The language of diplomacy layered with secrecy and coded warnings. Memos were redacted, files relocated, and some personnel quietly removed or reassigned to keep questions from spreading. But no matter how carefully the network was maintained, human curiosity, moral conscience, and the accumulation of anomalies meant that the cracks were widening. Even the most disciplined operatives began to question orders, some hesitating in the field, others quietly diverging from the path laid out decades before. The network's dual nature became increasingly evident. In some regions, it continued to prepare for an invasion that never came, exercises were conducted, caches maintained, and readiness tested. In others, cells acted autonomously, their activities intersecting with political violence and social unrest. It was an orchestra without a conductor, a machine whose cogs spun according to instructions, habit, and the judgment of men whose loyalties were no longer strictly defined. The planner observed the divergence with mounting anxiety, understanding that the invisible army was no longer a simple safeguard, but a living entity with its own trajectory, a force that could not be fully recalled once set into motion. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when the streets of European capitals were empty and the hum of daily life paused, he thought of the men and women walking ordinary paths, carrying extraordinary responsibilities. He thought of the young recruits who had signed oaths decades ago, who now smiled in cafes, ran shops, or sat in classrooms, unaware of the power they were entrusted with. He thought of the families who would never know the true purpose behind the instructions, the hidden radios, the caches in their basements or fields. The moral cost of obedience weighed on him, a silent presence that shadowed every decision he had made, every instruction he had signed. The first explosions of suspicion in Italy, the anomalous shipments in Belgium, the whispered warnings in France, and the growing network of concealed operations across the continent coalesced into a slow, relentless pressure. The planner understood that what began as a mechanism of defense could, and perhaps already had, evolved into a mechanism of manipulation. And while the men in London, Washington, and Brussels debated expansions and budgets in their formal meetings, the unspoken reality became increasingly clear. The network could act beyond the intentions of any individual, beyond oversight, and in the dark spaces between nations, its consequences would ripple quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly. As the teller continued to gather fragments of evidence, an offhand comment from a retired operative, a misplaced ledger, a hushed confession in a back room, the enormity of the story crystallized. The network was not just a historical curiosity. It was a living testament to the power of secrecy, the allure of control, and the peril of invisible authority. Every revelation was a spark in a tinderbox, every erased name, every hidden cache, a testament to the delicate balance between protection and corruption. The question loomed larger with each piece of the puzzle. Could an army built in shadows to protect freedom ultimately betray it from within, unseen and unstoppable? And so, as Europe slept in uneasy peace, the silent machinery continued its quiet pulse beneath cities and forests, a testament to foresight and paranoia, to loyalty and moral ambiguity, to the terrifying truth that the greatest threat might never be the enemy at the border, but the ghostly army we trained to defend ourselves, operating in silence, answering to no one, yet shaping the fate of nations. The first seeds of fear, once a whisper, had begun to grow into an unspoken dread, a recognition that the years of preparation, the oaths sworn, and the invisible soldiers embedded in everyday life could not be entirely contained. Somewhere, someone would pull at a thread, and when that thread unraveled, the hidden war that had been waged in silence for decades would finally make itself known, and no ledger, no memo, no oath could erase the consequences. The network was alive, not as a tool, but as a force, and in the minds of those who had built it, the first tremors of regret and doubt took root, preparing the ground for the storm that was yet to come. The revelations began quietly, as most truths do, slipping into the public sphere like water through cracks in a dam. It started with obscure hearings in Brussels, whispers in parliamentary corridors, journalists who had been following unexplained incidents, piecing together fragments that did not add up. The name Gladio surfaced in documents that were meant to remain buried, a word that carried the weight of decades and the threat of consequences too complex for ordinary comprehension. The hearings themselves were a theater of cautious words and veiled acknowledgments. Ministers and generals spoke in careful syntax, avoiding affirmation but also avoiding denial, their statements a delicate dance to preserve the illusion of control while acknowledging just enough to prevent outright dismissal. The teller, relentless in pursuit, traced shipments, cross-referenced memos, and interviewed operatives who had lived in the shadows for decades. Each new interview added dimension to a story that seemed too vast, too systematic to be accidental. Former recruits spoke of exercises that were never meant to be executed, but were detailed and precise, drills conducted with the intensity of preparation, and the meticulous documentation of events that would never exist. They remembered coded phrases, meetings in apartments where the floorboards creaked under the weight of hidden radios, and the sense that their actions, though invisible, had power. Power over whom exactly they could not always say, and the uncertainty weighed on them with the accumulation of years. In Italy, journalists who had begun investigating unexplained bombings and violent acts found themselves tracing patterns back to men who had been trained in secret programs. The connections were circumstantial, but persistent. A ledger here, a memo there, a coded message interpreted decades after the fact. Families of victims came forward, their accounts converging with official documents in ways that made the ordinary observer recoil. In Rome, a widow described a series of threats that escalated in intensity, each one anonymous but coordinated. In Milan, a retired operative recounted a network of safe houses that, when cross-referenced with police reports, suggested a reach far beyond defensive measures. The puzzle was enormous, and the more pieces that were revealed, the less coherent the picture became, an organism whose edges had frayed with time and whose internal mechanisms were hidden even from its architects. In Washington and London, intelligence circles scrambled to contain the narrative. Official denials were issued, statements carefully phrased to suggest oversight and accountability while keeping the machinery itself intact. Behind closed doors, officers debated strategy, the ethics of disclosure, and the necessity of secrecy. The tension was tangible, a tightrope walk between transparency demanded by democracies and operational imperatives that had, until that moment, been unquestioned. Every leak, every inadvertent acknowledgement threatened to expose a system built on decades of silence. The planner, whose life had been consumed with the maintenance of Gladio's infrastructure, felt the first real pangs of regret. Every dossier he had approved, every recruitment decision made in good faith, now risked being interpreted as complicity in events he had never sanctioned. He realized that the network he had nurtured as a defense mechanism could, and perhaps had, been co-opted for purposes that contradicted the moral foundation upon which it was built. The distinction between defense and subversion was no longer theoretical. It had been blurred by time, circumstance, and the autonomous behavior of operatives who had inherited a mission without oversight. The operations themselves were both extraordinary and banal. Radios transmitted messages that were never heard by civilians. Safe houses were maintained in quiet neighborhoods, and weapons caches remained dormant beneath floors, in fields, and inside ordinary homes. Yet, the human element, the decisions made in whispers, the ethical compromises, the bends in obedience, turned what had been designed as a shield into a complex web that could be interpreted, misused, or exploited. Every act of secrecy reinforced the belief in necessity, but with each reinforcement came the risk that the network's objectives could diverge from the intentions of its architects. The public, meanwhile, was slowly becoming aware. Reports filtered in from investigative journalists, academics, and former operatives. Newspapers published fragments, carefully vetted to avoid direct accusation, but enough to hint at the extraordinary. Headlines suggested secret armies, hidden caches, clandestine influence over political processes, and the specter of unsanctioned violence. Citizens read the accounts with disbelief, struggling to reconcile the notion of democracy with the existence of an invisible infrastructure operating beyond scrutiny. Fear and curiosity mingled. The invisible became visible, and with visibility came the first seeds of accountability. The teller, moving between archives and interviews, began to recognize the patterns that others overlooked. The same code names appeared in multiple countries, the same references to caches and exercises repeated in different contexts. Men who had disappeared into ordinary life were traced through obscure logistical footprints, shipments to innocuous addresses, training exercises documented under civilian pretexts, letters exchanged under the guise of social correspondence. Each connection was a thread, and the more threads were identified, the more the tapestry of clandestine influence revealed itself. It was a network not only designed to resist invasion, but capable of shaping events quietly, persistently, and without detection. The moral weight of this realization fell heavily on those who had built it. The planner, reviewing documents that had been in his possession for decades, felt the first true sense of the danger they had created. The network's autonomy, combined with its secrecy, meant that even minor deviations in protocol could escalate into consequences that were impossible to predict. The very structure that had been intended to preserve freedom now contained the potential to undermine it. He considered the recruits he had once trained, the young men and women who had obeyed orders without question, and understood that they were instruments in a system whose ethical boundaries had become indistinct over time. Across Europe, the manifestations of these tensions became tangible. Bombings in quiet towns, unexplained sabotage in industrial centers, and threats against public figures were investigated with increasing intensity. Patterns emerged that linked actions to elements of the network, though full accountability remained elusive. Investigators found themselves navigating a maze of missing files, redacted reports, and untraceable transfers of materials. Each new piece of evidence raised more questions than it answered, suggesting a scope far beyond what had been imagined. In Brussels, a confidential report detailed anomalies in shipments and resource allocations. Crates that were supposed to support training exercises appeared in politically sensitive areas. Communications intended to coordinate defensive measures had been repurposed for information gathering and influence operations. The planner understood, with a rising sense of dread, that the network's expansion into areas of political leverage had been facilitated not by overt orders, but by the interpretive discretion of operatives who had grown accustomed to acting in shadows. The line between defense and manipulation was no longer theoretical. It was operational, lived, and deeply consequential. The teller's investigations illuminated the human dimension of the network. Operatives, some still active, some retired, spoke of the psychological burdens of maintaining secrecy, the stress of carrying knowledge that could not be shared, and the moral ambiguity inherent in decisions made decades earlier. Families of operatives were sometimes aware only of minor absences or odd behaviors, unaware that a parent, sibling, or spouse had been part of a mechanism capable of extraordinary influence. The weight of hidden knowledge created fractures in personal relationships, eroding trust even as it enforced discipline. By the time the first public hearings began in the 1990s, The network was no longer a secret in practice, but remained elusive in detail. Politicians, journalists, and citizens clamored for clarity, yet the answers were fragmented, contested, and often obfuscated. The hearings themselves were tense, with officials carefully balancing acknowledgement against denial. Statements were crafted to preserve institutional reputation while attempting to provide sufficient information to satisfy public scrutiny. The tension in these rooms was palpable, a reflection of decades of covert preparation now intersecting with the inescapable glare of accountability. The planner, sitting in a quiet office, reviewed the documents presented during these hearings and felt a profound sense of unease. Every detail he had once deemed necessary for defense now appeared in a different light. Delayed shipments, unmonitored operations, the autonomy of operatives in the field. Each element, previously a testament to strategic foresight, now carried the potential for misuse, unintended consequences, and moral compromise. The invisible army he had helped construct was not merely a tool. It had become a living force, capable of acting beyond the intentions of its creators, and the implications were terrifying in their scope. And yet, despite the revelations, the network persisted. The infrastructure remained intact, the operatives still carried their oaths, and the hidden caches were untouched. The tension between secrecy and accountability, between preparedness and morality, remained unresolved. The planner and the teller understood that what had been conceived as protection now functioned as a cautionary tale. An invisible army built to defend democracy might ultimately test it in ways no one had anticipated. The shadows that had once been a source of comfort and strategy were now sources of anxiety and reflection. The silent pulse of the network continued beneath cities and fields, a testament to human ingenuity and the perils of unaccountable power. As the teller prepared to present his findings, the planner pondered the ultimate lesson of their creation, that the mechanisms we build to safeguard our future can, if left unchecked, shape it in ways both unpredictable and irreversible. The moral weight of the network, its autonomy, and the consequences of decades-long secrecy converged into a single, unavoidable truth. The quiet army that had lain in wait for decades was no longer merely a potential force against invasion. It had become a force that, in its silence, demanded reckoning. The day the veil began to lift was not marked by fanfare or global headlines. It started with a quiet leak in a Brussels archive, a misfiled memo that referenced Gladio in passing, almost as an afterthought. The journalist who discovered it initially dismissed it, assuming it was a relic from post-war planning with no relevance to contemporary politics. Yet, the further she traced the document, the more impossible it became to ignore the connections. References to clandestine networks, hidden caches, and coded operations spanned decades and multiple countries. The evidence hinted at an organization operating parallel to governments, one whose power and autonomy exceeded what most officials had ever imagined. As she dug deeper, she realized the implications were staggering. Italy, Belgium, France, Germany. Each had been home to secret units embedded within civilian life, trained, armed, and ready to act at a moment's notice. Their existence had been justified as a safeguard against Soviet invasion. But decades later, these networks were implicated in domestic political manipulation, sabotage, and violence. Bombings in small towns, assassinations, and unexplained disappearances were no longer random tragedies. They were connected, and the organizers had operated with impunity under the guise of national security. The revelation sparked immediate and intense controversy. Parliamentary hearings were convened, journalists demanded answers, and citizens protested what many saw as a betrayal of democratic trust. Ministers and generals who had once overseen or tacitly approved the networks faced scrutiny for actions carried out in their name but without public accountability. Some officials feigned ignorance, claiming that decades of secrecy had rendered them unaware of the network's operational realities. But the meticulous documentation and ledger entries told a different story. There was no hiding behind bureaucratic walls. The ghosts of planning and secrecy had left too many traces. In Rome, families of victims came forward, their testimonies chilling and precise. A father spoke of a school bombing in the early 1970s that had been officially blamed on left-wing extremists, yet internal reports suggested the involvement of a cell trained and supported by the Gladio network. A widow in Milan recounted threats against her husband in 1974 that had escalated before his sudden disappearance. Letters and instructions found decades later linked the case directly to clandestine operatives. Investigators began piecing together a mosaic of covert influence, and the public began to grasp that the institutions meant to protect them had also nurtured forces capable of internal destabilization. The teller, ever vigilant, traced these events with painstaking care. Every coded message, every obscure ledger entry, every operational note was cross-referenced to build a coherent chronology. In Brussels, shipments of explosives, weapons, and radios, originally intended for defensive exercises, had been diverted, sometimes into areas of political significance. In Italy, safe houses meant for covert drills were used in preparation for unsanctioned operations. The evidence painted a picture of a network that had evolved beyond its original defensive mandate, acting with its own internal logic and discretion. Public hearings were broadcast, the first cracks in official denial appearing for all to see. Politicians carefully crafted statements, neither fully acknowledging nor outright denying the existence of the networks. Witnesses testified under oath, some reluctantly, others defiant, revealing a landscape of duplicity and control that was both shocking and unsettling. The notion that secret armies could exist within the structures of democratic states, answering only to select officials and hidden hierarchies, challenged the very foundation of civic trust. Citizens who had grown up believing in transparent governance now confronted a reality in which covert power had been exercised for decades without oversight. The moral complexity weighed heavily on those who had once administered or facilitated these operations. The planner, reviewing decades of correspondence, shipment logs, and memos, recognized the unintended consequences of his foresight. Decisions made in the shadow of Cold War paranoia had morphed into instruments of domestic manipulation. Autonomy granted to operatives to respond to hypothetical invasions had, over time, resulted in autonomous actions whose ethical and legal implications were murky at best. The mechanisms of secrecy had become mechanisms of control, and the very architects of Gladio confronted the paradox of an invisible army whose loyalty could no longer be assumed. Operatives themselves faced crises of conscience. Many had spent decades following instructions without question, believing themselves to be defenders of freedom. Now, confronted with the consequences of actions taken under the network's aegis, they were forced to reckon with the human cost. Families of victims, colleagues, and the public demanded accountability, and the distinction between obedience and complicity became impossible to ignore. Some chose to speak, risking personal safety and professional reprisal, while others remained silent, their silence now part of the moral calculus. In international forums, intelligence agencies scrambled to control the narrative. NATO officials emphasized defensive intent. CIA and MI6 spokespeople highlighted oversight measures, and yet each statement was shadowed by decades of accumulated secrecy. The global community struggled to reconcile the existence of parallel military structures with the principles of national sovereignty and democracy. Scholars, journalists, and analysts dissected the evidence, revealing a complex architecture of influence and control that spanned national borders and decades of geopolitical tension. Italy became the epicenter of scrutiny. Investigators uncovered that certain operations previously attributed to domestic terrorist groups had likely been influenced or facilitated by Gladio cells. Evidence suggested coordination, training, and logistical support originating from the hidden network. The social and political ramifications were profound. Questions arose not only about historical accountability, but about contemporary governance and the extent to which democratic institutions had been unknowingly compromised. Meanwhile, Belgium and France grappled with similar revelations. In Brussels, leaked documents traced covert operations to government-sanctioned units operating under code names and hidden hierarchies. Investigators identified procurement of weapons and explosives that had been systematically unaccounted for, their intended purpose misaligned with publicly stated national defense priorities. In France, parliamentary debates escalated into heated confrontations, exposing rifts between intelligence communities, elected officials, and the public. The tension was not merely legal or political. It was existential, forcing societies to confront the limits of oversight, transparency, and the potential for institutional betrayal. The media coverage, while initially fragmented, coalesced into a sustained campaign exposing Gladio's influence. Newspapers published leaked ledgers, interviews with former operatives, and investigative analyses that revealed the scale and complexity of the network. The public response was one of shock, outrage, and fear, with many citizens struggling to reconcile the ideal of democratic governance with decades of covert manipulation. Protest movements emerged, demanding accountability, transparency, and justice for victims whose suffering had been obscured by layers of secrecy. Amidst this upheaval, the planner grappled with the psychological toll of revelation. Decisions made decades earlier, guided by a sense of duty and the exigencies of a polarized world, were now subject to moral and legal scrutiny. The certainty of defensive necessity had eroded, replaced by ambiguity and responsibility for unforeseen consequences. He reflected on the paradox of secrecy. The more effective a network is at remaining invisible, the more dangerous it becomes when it is exposed. What had been conceived as protection now demanded reckoning. The teller, documenting and presenting findings to a growing audience of academics, journalists, and policymakers, recognized the broader implications of Gladio. It was not merely an historical footnote. It was a lens through which to examine the tension between security and liberty, secrecy and accountability. The network's existence revealed the capacity for clandestine structures to operate parallel to official governance, their actions shaping political, social, and human outcomes over decades. The story was as much about the moral and ethical consequences of hidden power as it was about the operational achievements or failures of intelligence agencies. Evidence of coordination between cells in multiple countries emerged. Weapons caches that had been meticulously maintained for decades were linked to operations affecting domestic politics rather than foreign defense. Operatives were found to have acted with discretion that had unintended consequences, illustrating the autonomy inherent in the network. Investigations demonstrated that what had been designed to protect democracy had, in isolated instances, undermined it, creating a paradox that society had to confront. International responses varied. NATO emphasized oversight reforms. Intelligence agencies promised stricter accountability, and parliamentary inquiries pledged transparency. Yet the sheer complexity of the network, its decades-long evolution, and the diffuse autonomy of operatives meant that full clarity was unattainable. The legacy of Gladio was embedded in institutions, culture, and human behavior in ways that could not be entirely rectified. Awareness of the network's existence altered public perception of national security, trust in institutions, and the balance between freedom and protection. As hearings and investigations unfolded, the public became aware of specific operations that had been carried out under Gladio's aegis. Bombings in northern Italy, unexplained disappearances, and incidents of sabotage were re-examined with a new understanding. Families of victims long marginalized or dismissed were given a platform to recount experiences, humanizing the abstract network of secrecy and revealing the emotional and societal toll of decades-long clandestine operations. The planner, now aged and reflective, understood that the network he had helped build would never be fully reconciled with the ethical frameworks of democratic societies. Its existence challenged assumptions about accountability, governance, and the unintended consequences of secrecy. He recognized that protective intent could not justify actions that, once revealed, produced harm, and that the autonomy he had once valued as a strategic advantage carried moral weight that could not be dismissed. The teller continued to document the unfolding story, emphasizing not only historical facts, but the broader lessons about power, secrecy, and responsibility. He demonstrated that while Gladio had been conceived as a shield against potential external threats, its operational reality revealed vulnerabilities inherent in any structure that operates beyond oversight. The network's evolution, actions, and exposure offered a cautionary tale about the dangers of invisible authority and the ethical complexities of clandestine preparation. And as Europe grappled with the revelations, societies were forced to confront uncomfortable truths that hidden networks designed for protection could be co-opted, misused, and act autonomously, that secrecy, even when justified, can erode trust, and that the line between defense and subversion is not only fine, but often indistinguishable. The moral, political, and social reckoning was ongoing, demonstrating that the shadow of Gladio would extend long beyond the decades of its silent operation. The first wave of public accountability concluded with partial disclosures, reforms, and prosecutions. Yet, many operatives remained anonymous, many actions untraceable, and many questions unanswered. The planner reflected on the unintended consequences of foresight, the burden of secrecy, and the lessons to be drawn from a network that had both protected and imperiled the very societies it was meant to serve. In the quiet, after hearings and publications, the silent pulse of Gladio lingered in the memory of nations, a testament to the enduring complexity of invisible power, human ambition, and the fragile line between defense and dominion. The exposure of Gladio did not bring clarity. It brought questions that no one could fully answer, shadows that stretched across decades and borders, and a reckoning that was as psychological as it was political. The public hearings and investigative reports had revealed the network's existence, its hidden caches, its operatives embedded in ordinary life, and the unintended consequences of decades-long secrecy, but the true extent of influence remained elusive. The planner, now older, walked through the corridors of memory and bureaucracy alike, realizing that even with revelations, the human element, the choices, discretion, and interpretation of operatives could never be entirely traced or accounted for. In the aftermath, former operatives wrestled with conscience. Some spoke, some wrote memoirs under pseudonyms, others disappeared into anonymity, carrying the weight of knowledge that could never be fully disclosed. Each revelation they contributed, whether to journalists or judicial inquiries, revealed further layers of complexity, coded instructions that had been repurposed, exercises that had been co-opted into operations with unintended civilian impact, and autonomous decisions by field operatives whose obedience had evolved into initiative. The network's human architecture had become a lattice of responsibility, guilt, and moral ambiguity. Internationally, responses were inconsistent. NATO emphasized structural reforms, proposing new oversight mechanisms, reporting requirements, and intergovernmental coordination. MI6 and the CIA issued careful statements claiming historical oversight while emphasizing lessons learned, yet the opacity of decades-long clandestine operations meant that full disclosure was impossible. Scholars and journalists argued that the network's reach had been underestimated, its autonomy underappreciated, and the moral consequences largely ignored. Europe, forced to confront decades of silent manipulation, began a slow, uneven process of institutional introspection. Italy, still reeling from the years of lead, faced particularly stark scrutiny. Bombings, kidnappings, and political sabotage that had once been attributed to ideological factions were re-examined with an understanding of Gladio's operational influence. Families of victims emerged from silence, recounting threats, disappearances, and unexplained violence that had shaped their lives. The ledger, once a silent repository of names and codes, now symbolized the intersection of secrecy, obedience, and unintended consequences. Courts, and investigative commissions attempted to piece together chains of command, but much remained hidden, lost, or deliberately obfuscated. The psychological toll on those who had built and maintained the network was immense. The planner and his contemporaries, who had believed in the moral imperative of preparing for invasion, were confronted with the reality that preparation had become manipulation, secrecy had become control, and the very networks meant to defend democracy had sometimes undermined it. The moral weight of decades of hidden action could not be quantified, and each recollection, each uncovered directive, acted as a reminder of the dual-edged nature of clandestine power. In Belgium, France, and Germany, similar reflections took place. Investigators followed trails of previously unaccounted weapons, untraceable shipments, and unexplained incidents, each of which highlighted the autonomy of operatives and the gaps in oversight. Networks that were invisible by design had evolved into instruments that could act independently, sometimes in ways contrary to the intentions of architects or governments. The more evidence emerged, the more apparent it became that secrecy, even when justified, carried the potential for moral and societal consequences that persisted long after operational necessity had ended. The teller continued to document the unfolding story, framing it as not just historical revelation, but an examination of human and institutional behavior under the pressures of secrecy. His analyses emphasized the interplay between operational necessity and ethical responsibility, showing how long-term clandestine structures inevitably test the bounds of democratic accountability. By tracing the arc from post-war planning through decades of covert preparation and misaligned execution, he highlighted a paradox. Networks designed to protect could, in practice, obscure and endanger the very societies they aimed to defend. Victims' testimonies reinforced the human dimension of the network's legacy. Parents, spouses, and children recounted years of ambiguity, fear, and loss, providing a sobering counterpoint to bureaucratic explanations and operational justifications. Each story illustrated the tangible consequences of decades-long secrecy, emphasizing that the cost of clandestine preparedness was not merely political or strategic, but profoundly personal. The ledger's erased names, once abstract, became symbolic of lives affected, trust eroded, and justice deferred. The public reckoning forced governments to consider structural reforms. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened, interagency coordination improved, and transparency measures introduced. Yet, the inherent autonomy and operational dispersion of the network meant that full accountability was impossible. Gladio had operated in spaces that were deliberately opaque, and even with disclosure, the full range of action, influence, and human decision-making could not be entirely reconstructed. Society faced the uncomfortable recognition that invisible power, once exercised, leaves enduring ripples beyond immediate comprehension. Simultaneously, historical interpretation became contested. Academics, journalists, and former intelligence officers debated the balance between necessity and consequence, the ethical limits of preparation, and the responsibility of governments in authorizing secretive structures. Some argued that Gladio was an essential defensive precaution in a world threatened by ideological conflict. Others emphasized the moral and social costs, citing evidence of domestic destabilization and human harm. The debate reflected broader questions about the exercise of state power, the role of secrecy in democracy, and the unforeseen consequences of long-term clandestine operations. The planner, reflecting privately, acknowledged that the network he had constructed was both achievement and cautionary tale. It had succeeded in creating readiness, discipline, and operational capacity that no conventional framework could have matched, yet it had also demonstrated the peril inherent in unaccountable autonomy. Even the most disciplined operatives, acting under decades of instruction, could diverge from intended objectives, and the very mechanisms of secrecy that ensured operational effectiveness now complicated efforts to assign responsibility or restore public trust. Europe itself was transformed by the exposure. The public consciousness shifted, and citizens became aware that the post-war order included layers of hidden authority capable of influencing events quietly and persistently. Democratic institutions were challenged to reconcile operational necessity with oversight, security with liberty, and secrecy with accountability. Gladio's legacy, once invisible, now served as a lens through which societies could examine the fragile boundaries between protection and control, preparation and manipulation. The human dimension of secrecy endured in the minds of former operatives. Many wrestled with guilt, moral ambiguity, and the long-term consequences of obedience without full knowledge. Families continued to grapple with loss and disruption, their stories serving as a counterbalance to bureaucratic narratives. The moral weight of clandestine operations became evident not just in public discourse, but in private lives, illustrating that the consequences of invisible power are both institutional and personal. Even decades after exposure, the network's infrastructure remained partially intact. Safe houses, weapons caches, and operational knowledge persisted, though often dormant. The planner recognized that operational readiness, once embedded, cannot be fully undone. Human and material elements endure beyond intent, revealing the permanence of clandestine influence. Gladio's enduring presence, though diminished, highlighted a broader truth. Networks created to act in shadows are not easily dismantled, and their consequences persist long after the rationale for their creation has faded. The teller's documentation culminated in a synthesis of operational history, ethical analysis, and societal impact. By tracing the arc from post-war creation to public exposure, he illustrated how secrecy, necessity, and autonomy intersected to create both strategic benefit and moral hazard. The story emphasized that while invisible armies may protect against external threats, they simultaneously pose internal risks whose consequences unfold over generations, challenging assumptions about accountability, governance, and human responsibility. In the quiet reflection following public exposure, the planner contemplated the ultimate lesson of Gladio. The machinery of secrecy, once set into motion, develops a life of its own. Its operators, its decisions, and its infrastructure extend beyond the intentions of any individual or government. The ledger, the caches, the operatives, each represented a node in a network that had both defended and imperiled society. The moral paradox of preparation, the autonomy of action, and the enduring consequences of secrecy crystallized into a sobering realization. The greatest challenge of clandestine power is not in building it, but in reckoning with what it becomes. The legacy of Gladio, as it settled into history, became a case study in human ambition, institutional discretion, and ethical responsibility. It served as a reminder that invisible networks, even when conceived for protection, carry consequences that can unfold unpredictably. The interplay between secrecy and accountability, between operational success and moral compromise, remained unresolved, leaving societies to navigate the complex inheritance of decades of clandestine preparation. And in the end, the network's silent pulse, once hidden beneath ordinary streets and everyday lives, continued to resonate in memory, law, and discourse, a testament to the enduring tension between the need for security and the imperative of moral oversight. A cautionary tale of invisible armies whose shadows extend far beyond their intended purpose. The echoes of Gladio did not fade with time. They reverberated quietly, insidiously, through the corridors of intelligence agencies and the minds of those who reflected on the network's legacy. In the years following the public exposure, lessons were dissected, debated, and sometimes ignored, leaving a trail of ethical and operational questions that would shape the policies and decisions of modern covert operations. Governments understood that the mere act of disclosure did not erase the mechanisms, the infrastructure, or the precedent for autonomous hidden power. Planners, analysts, and operatives alike faced the challenge of reconciling historical insight with contemporary imperatives, a tension that would define the next generation of intelligence work. In London, discussions in MI6 focused on the moral calculus of secrecy. Officers reviewed case studies of Gladio, parsing the lines between necessity and overreach, and considering how lessons from decades ago could inform the design of accountability in modern covert networks. The debate was never purely academic. It carried immediate operational weight. How much autonomy should an operative have in the field? How could a government ensure loyalty without creating the conditions for moral compromise? Could the infrastructure of secrecy ever be designed without leaving traces of potential misuse? Each question was fraught with historical resonance, the ghost of Gladio hovering over every policy deliberation. Across the Atlantic, the CIA examined the structural and ethical implications in internal reviews. Gladio's existence was dissected not just as a European anomaly, but as a cautionary tale. Lessons on vetting, oversight, and operational restraint became benchmarks for new programs. Analysts noted the pattern that even the most disciplined operatives, when given autonomy without accountability, could evolve into actors capable of unintended influence. Modern operations, therefore, increasingly emphasized layered oversight, internal auditing, and rigorous documentation, measures designed to prevent a repeat of the historical precedent that had allowed Gladio to operate in the shadows for decades. In Brussels, NATO officials considered reforms that extended beyond Europe. They recognized that intelligence and military coordination, when unmonitored, carried risks that transcended borders. Protocols were revised, oversight mechanisms strengthened, and new doctrines emphasized ethical responsibility alongside operational readiness. Yet, even with these reforms, the legacy of Gladio remained a silent warning that clandestine power, once embedded, cannot be fully contained, and its consequences often ripple unpredictably through political, social, and human landscapes. The planner, long retired but still reflecting on the network he had helped construct, watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. On one hand, modern intelligence agencies were integrating lessons that could prevent the moral ambiguities he had faced. On the other, the persistence of secrecy in human institutions meant that even these lessons could be partially implemented, ignored, or circumvented. He recognized that the ethical challenges of clandestine operations were inherent to their nature. Any structure designed to operate in shadows inherently tested the boundaries of accountability and human morality. As contemporary intelligence networks evolved, the specter of Gladio served as both guide and warning. Covert operations, whether for counterterrorism, cyber defense, or geopolitical influence, adopted layers of encryption, autonomous field units, and contingency planning reminiscent of post-war strategies. Yet, with every innovation, the ethical dilemmas remained: the need for secrecy versus transparency, operational effectiveness versus moral responsibility, and strategic advantage versus societal accountability. The lessons of Gladio underscored that technical and operational sophistication cannot resolve the fundamental challenge of human discretion in clandestine power. Journalists and historians continued to draw parallels between Gladio and contemporary operations. Investigative reporting revealed covert activities across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, emphasizing the persistent tension between national security imperatives and democratic oversight. Analysts highlighted cases in which autonomous field decisions, similar in structure if not in scale to Gladio's operations, led to unforeseen consequences: political destabilization, civilian harm, and erosion of public trust. Each revelation prompted reflection. The structures may have changed, technologies advanced, but the ethical questions remained strikingly familiar. In the digital age, intelligence networks faced new challenges that amplified the lessons of Gladio. Cyber operations, drone deployments, and AI-assisted surveillance offered unprecedented reach and precision, but also introduced new avenues for unintended consequences. Autonomous systems, algorithmic decision-making, and opaque digital infrastructures mirrored the operational autonomy that had characterized Gladio, raising questions about responsibility, oversight, and accountability. Analysts drew lessons from the past, emphasizing that technological sophistication cannot absolve human agencies from ethical obligations or prevent moral ambiguity when operational discretion is delegated without scrutiny. Modern operatives trained in these principles navigated an environment where historical awareness was as critical as tactical skill. They were taught to balance initiative with adherence to legal and ethical frameworks, aware that the mistakes of decades past, decisions made in shadows, autonomy exercised without oversight, could no longer be tolerated without consequence. The memory of Gladio lingered in training manuals, scenario simulations, and strategic planning exercises, a constant reminder that clandestine power carries inherent moral and societal risks. Governments, too, faced structural reckoning. Oversight committees, parliamentary reviews, and interagency auditing became standard practice in nations previously reliant on opaque networks. Yet the enduring challenge remained: how to ensure operational secrecy sufficient for national defense while preventing autonomy from slipping into unsanctioned influence. Gladio's legacy had made it clear that the human element, the capacity for independent decision-making, moral interpretation, and ethical compromise, cannot be fully regulated by protocol or procedure. The network's historical echo was a caution that all hidden power structures carry latent risk. As time progressed, Gladio evolved in memory and influence. It became a lens through which intelligence ethics, modern operational planning, and democratic accountability were debated and taught. Case studies, conferences, and academic research emphasized the lessons learned, highlighting the persistent tension between necessity and overreach, autonomy and oversight, secrecy and public trust. The network's exposure, though decades removed from its creation, continued to shape policy, philosophy, and operational design across Europe and beyond. The planner, reflecting in quiet moments, understood that Gladio's ultimate lesson transcended operational history. It was a study in human judgment, institutional responsibility, and the delicate equilibrium between protection and control. Clandestine structures, by their very nature, challenge moral clarity. Their existence tests society's capacity to balance security with transparency, effectiveness with ethics, and autonomy with accountability. In every modern covert network, the principles, errors, and consequences of Gladio resonate, a reminder that power exercised in secrecy always carries enduring echoes. As investigative journalists, historians, and intelligence professionals continued to analyze the network, a recurring theme emerged. Clandestine power, when unaccountable, has the potential to shape not only outcomes, but perceptions, policies, and public trust. Gladio had shown that even defensive networks, conceived with the noblest intentions, could produce results contrary to their stated purpose. The operational lessons were clear, but the ethical and societal implications were profound. Secrecy is never neutral, and autonomy without accountability carries a cost measured not only in lives affected, but in the erosion of trust that underpins democracy itself. The echoes of Gladio also shaped international discourse. NATO, European governments, and allied intelligence services incorporated historical awareness into doctrine, emphasizing ethical frameworks, oversight, and accountability. The network's history became a touchstone for discussions of covert operations, reminding policymakers and practitioners alike that operational success cannot be divorced from moral responsibility. Gladio's story illuminated the persistent tension between preparation and principle, secrecy and society, power and oversight, a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in the aftermath of the Cold War. In the final analysis, Gladio's legacy is neither purely cautionary nor entirely condemnatory. It demonstrates human ingenuity, strategic foresight, and operational sophistication, while simultaneously exposing the perils of autonomy, secrecy, and unexamined authority. Modern intelligence networks, whether European, American, or global, inherit both the operational blueprint and the ethical dilemmas of post-war clandestine planning. The challenge is not only to employ skill and strategy, but to navigate the moral and societal consequences of every hidden action. And so, The story of Gladio closes not with the finality of resolution, but with the enduring resonance of reflection. It is a narrative of preparation and power, secrecy and consequence, human judgment and institutional responsibility. Its echoes persist in the training of operatives, the drafting of policy, and the vigilance of societies that must balance security with liberty. The silent army that once lay hidden beneath Europe's streets now exists in memory, law, and discourse, a testament to the enduring complexities of clandestine power and the lessons it imprints upon every subsequent generation of intelligence, ethics, and covert operations. And there you have it, the hidden armies of Europe, the secret operatives of NATO, CIA, and MI6, and the shadow network that operated in silence for decades. Operation Gladio was never just history. It's a reminder that secrecy, power, and moral ambiguity often walk hand in hand. What was meant to protect, sometimes controlled, what was meant to defend, sometimes manipulated, and what was hidden for decades now shapes how we see intelligence, trust, and democracy. If this story left you questioning what really happens behind closed doors, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear from you, where you're watching from, and what secret histories keep you awake at night. From the hidden corners of history to the shadows of intelligence, this is Chronicles of Sleep, bringing you the stories the world tried to keep buried. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next deep dive into the secrets that shape our world.